Well, I'd like to thank Acting Administrator for FEMA, Pete Gaynor, for coming down from Washington to meet with me and our team today as we await the final impacts of Hurricane Dorian. As Dorian was approaching, well, you go back a week and a half ago and we thought that it was going to be broken up over the mountains of Hispaniola. Then we thought impacts with Puerto Rico was kind of the main concern. And then as it went northeast of Puerto Rico, we saw a big runway for this thing to get very, very strong. And from that, from the very beginning, we've been working with the president, his administration, FEMA, and the mantra has just been a big storm requires preparations and a big response. And that's the posture that we've had. And if you think about this, we had roughly 100 miles off Florida's coast, a storm churning at 185 mile per hour with sustained winds and 220 mile an hour gusts. And the Bahamas were hit, I think, unlike very many storms in Florida's history. That was very, very close to impacting us in a very, very major way. I know it's been frustrating for a lot of folks, for Floridians to look and see, is it going to come in my direction? Is it going to come in another? There have been times throughout this process where there were credible paths that took this thing to the west coast of Florida, to northwest Florida, of course across the state, up 95, up the center of the state. And so really we could make a case going back a week and a half that pretty much any of our 67 counties could have been directly impacted by this thing. As it's gone on, we've been able to hone in on it a little bit better. But for it to basically stay in place for like a day and a half, rather than continue going west towards Florida and then now turn north. How these things happen, I don't know. This is going to be riding Florida's coast for the next day and a half. While we think this is a much better track than when we were looking at 72 hours ago, we just ask people to stay safe, remain vigilant. There will be some effects in the state of Florida. There'll be storm surge, there'll be some flooding. You may see wind damage depending on how close this gets to the state of Florida. But at the end of the day, being safe is the most important. And I appreciate a lot of Floridians hanging in there. I've been speaking with some of the local officials in some of these counties, and they've reported by and large, folks, they've understood the drill. They've taken what steps need to be taken, and it's not something that we enjoy because obviously this was a Labor Day weekend. People have other things that they can be doing, but nevertheless, I think people locally and all the way up have handled it well. So we're here, until the duration, monitoring this thing. I wanted to give Acting Administrator Gaynor an opportunity to say a few things, and we'll both be available for some questions.
Thank you, Governor. So this storm is one for the record books. Day 11, I think, for probably those in Florida and those for us in FEMA and DC. More days to go. The threat is not over. And I just want to thank the governor and his staff, Jared. The way you get a great response is to have great partners. So from the federal level, our federal partners, the whole of federal government response, to include our private partners, local, county, and the most important part of the response is individuals being prepared for these kind of storms. And it doesn't take much to imagine what could have happened in Florida or in other states up the coast when it comes to Dorian, when you look at the Bahamas. I think we're fortunate that this will have minimal impact on Florida. It's still not over yet, so be prepared for any scenario. But take some lessons from Dorian, Cat 5 storm, 10th largest storm on record in the Atlantic. And again, I want to thank our partners because without you, it just doesn't get done. So with that, Governor?
Anyone got any questions for either Pete or myself?
Are you still urging Floridians in evacuation zones to get out? I mean, traffic
heed the orders. I think just listen, because there's different effects that can happen. Some of these communities have experienced flooding with less than what we're facing now. You have different erosion issues that can make some of the structures unsafe with certain impacts. So I would just listen to what those local folks are telling you. And as this thing moves, People will be able to move back into their places, but it's just not worth trying to get out ahead of those folks right now. I think they all, we work with them from the beginning. They were all very cognizant of kind of what those orders mean for people. They did not do it willy-nilly. We certainly were not going to do it willy-nilly and create a lot of chaos and panic. So I think it was done very deliberately, but I think it was done in a way to try to keep people safe.
What contact are state or federal officials establishing with the Bahamas in terms of relief, and who's coordinating that? What's the plan to make sure that supplies are being used?
So it's Pete and I talked about this. It's a Department of State mission at the federal level. So you have State Department assets. You do have, I believe, some U.S. Coast Guard assets that are there. Of course, here in Florida, we've got a lot of Floridians that travel to the Bahamas on vacation. People have homes there. We do have folks who are Bahamian American in Florida. So I think that there's, you're going to see a lot of people in Florida want to help that effort. I think you'll probably raise a lot of money privately. We obviously are focusing on what happens with our state in terms of our government resources, but once that passes, I've told General Eifert if there is a request from the National Guard to assist with that we would be willing to meet that request.
Governor, I know that you've had some conversations with Senator Scott and Senator Ruby over the last few days. Are you coordinating your messages with them in any fashion? And do you have any concerns that perhaps other elected officials may be saying things that are a little bit different than what you're saying?
People can say what they want. I think I talked to Marco again today. We've basically, we're monitoring the storm, obviously, preparing for the worst. Now that we've gotten a more favorable track, we want to make sure, and I've talked with Pete Gaynor about this and the president, just making sure that those folks locally and at the state level that took the protective measures, expended resources to prepare for the storm, that we get the appropriate declaration where we can get that reimbursed for particularly for our counties, because I think that they basically did the right thing to be prepared for this. We obviously did a lot at the state level to be prepared, and in hindsight, people say, well, did this county really need to spend this much or that? Well, obviously, if they knew the storm was going to turn, then they probably wouldn't have needed to do as much, but you just don't know that. So I think that they behave responsibly. So I talked with Marco probably about an hour or two ago about that, and we're going to be working with the administration to basically provide the reimbursements, and then I think that sends a good message that it really is the right thing to do to be prepared.
There are mandatory evacuations in about a dozen counties or so. How long will those evacuations be in place?
I think they're all dependent on the local conditions, and I think that people just need to discuss it or speak with their local officials about it. I'd imagine part of the thing about how long these things was this storm has moved so slowly that this is different than a lot of the other storms, and so putting a time limit on it was probably something that was difficult for some of the counties. But I can tell you this: they all want to be able to get people back into their places. They're not going to want to keep people out beyond what is necessary, but I think they're going to err on the side of safety.
The same with the shelters. You still have about almost 10,000 people reported in shelters. I'm assuming that the southern counties are starting to close those shelters.
I don't know if they've closed any yet. I don't think so. So, obviously, I think they waited and were prudent about when they opened the shelters. Some people said they should have opened them earlier, but as it turned out, they did it at the right time. And so, yeah, I think that's fine for the time being. And just in speaking with folks, I think there have been, I've not really heard a lot of problems with people refusing to evacuate. Obviously we know a lot of people typically don't always evacuate. That's just the nature. But the reports I've been getting has been similar to what was done with Matthew along the East Coast, and the response has been pretty similar.
A number of cities and counties have been frustrated by how long it's taken to be reimbursed for past hurricanes. What are you doing about that?
Well, we've done a lot about that. So when I came in, how much had we distributed for Hurricane Michael? Like 500,000?
So We did 203 million for Michael in a 6-month period.
But
of
before
time.
we started,
So in that same 6-month period of time for Irma, they had only done about 500,000.
yeah. So basically, there was FEMA would take. They have processes they go through because the law imposes that on them, and then the money would come to Florida. And I said, Jared, get the money out quicker from our level. So Jared really, redid this whole thing to make it, I think, more sensible so that once we have the money, yes, we do whatever audits and make sure that the money is should be reimbursable, but getting that money out. And so we had not had a lot of money put out on the street. We've put out, hundreds of millions or whatever, 200 million for Michael. And so that's something, because I lived through Matthew, and I'd have my local folks come to me as the congressman saying, Congressman, we need this money. And so then I would be like yelling at FEMA about it. But sometimes FEMA was actually putting the money out and then the state was taking too long. So we've changed that. I think it's been changed for the better. We also did that. We got hundreds of, 150 million in citrus money, at least 150 million in citrus money. That's now gotten out. That was all the way from Hurricane Irma. And so we view it as important to try to get it out as soon as we can.
In one of the previous briefings, I believe there was concern expressed about possible flooding in northeast Florida, especially considering what happened with Matthew. Is that still a major concern as it makes its way north?
It's a concern. I just spoke with Sheriff Williams about it. They're optimistic that the effects will be less than what were in Matthew, because if you look at the track of the storm, it's going to be further off the coast, and the rain bands are weaker on the west side of the storm, it seems like. But that's something that they're obviously bracing for, and that's something that you have to brace for if you're in that area.
Back on approving the public assistance grant funding for FEMA, I know that DEM had done everything possible to speed things up. And there was also a process with FEMA that FEMA was also seeing some kinks in the process as well. Have any changes been made in regards to that? For instance, I think there was a review process for Congress that actually a lot of members used to put out press releases. Have you seen any changes in that regard, or maybe any chance that you can free up that area?
One of our overarching goals, especially when it comes to recovery, is to reduce the complexity of FEMA. In some cases, the policies that we have, the regulations that we have, the statutes that we have are kind of piled on top of each other. One of our goals is to make it much simpler for those that get a disaster declaration, get reimbursed as quickly as possible. We know in some cases that jurisdictions, it's an economic impact on their budget. They may not have enough capacity to handle the billions or millions of dollars beyond their annual appropriations. So again, we're trying to make that smoother. It's not a perfect system. Our goal is to make it as perfect as we can.
Governor, all the assets you mentioned in previous briefings, the 17,000 for FPL, just staging and different stuff. Are they going to be going to other states now? What are they?
So I would imagine that. So we've got state mutual aid, and I think Jared can say for sure. But we still have a lot of that here. And then once the storm passes, probably we'll end up going up the coast. FEMA's got a lot of assets here. They're already preparing to move it up the coast. And then, FPL's looking at, if this is less significant than Michael in terms of the power outages, then they're looking at, obviously, they'll have more than enough people to do that. And so I think some of those crews are out of state already. So you're going to see those probably move further north to be able to deal with the other southeast effects.
You said at the beginning that you didn't want to have things sort of be undertaken in a willy-nilly fashion. I believe that's what you said. And I just wanted to know whether or not you made a conscious determination in saying, I'm going to defer to the locals on evacuations. Were you thinking of in the past?
What we were doing was consulting with the locals. But here's how I viewed it as, I can sit here and just say whatever I want. But if the local folks aren't bought into it, I don't think it'll be effective. And so I'd much rather work with them, come to a solution that may be 90% of what Jared and I think's ideal, but then all be unified in that so we have a coherent message than to kind of be at loggerheads with folks. And the thing about here is that the folks on the local emergency operations level, they're very good at what they do, particularly on the coastal counties, because this is something that they have to deal with. And so my view is, let's harness that experience and let's work together. And so I think it's worked better. I think there was frustration in the past when people were kind of crisscrossing the state, having to evacuate. Actually, some people evacuating into the storm path because they were told to evacuate at a certain time. The storm track changed, and so they're going from Miami to Tampa. Then they go back from Tampa back to Central Florida or back to the east coast of Florida. So we wanted to do it in a way where it would be I think a collaborative effort. And I think ultimately, as I've looked at these things in the past, storm response to me is a bottom-up effort. And it really starts in the counties. We obviously have an important role at the state to coordinate, and then you got the FEMA folks who are there offering the federal assistance. But that's really, I think, the way that it is most effective. And I think that's I think that was borne out so far with how this has gone, and I think that's going to continue to be our approach going forward. All right, well, we'll be back if we have anything more. Thanks.
Thank you.